thank you all coming for the pre-concert lecture, coming to tonight's concert for the season opener of the 2018-2019 NJFO season, New Jersey Festival Orchestra. Some of you may know my name is Michael Rosin, and I am their music historian, which means I write the program notes in the program. I curate research online, and I do posts and little media things. And also my favorite, I deliver the pre-concert lectures for all the classical concerts. There's only 3 a year, the season opener, opera, that's around March, end of February, and then the season finale in May. So I'm gonna go, sometimes I don't go in order of the pieces as they're played. I'm imagining it's the Gershwin first, then the Bruch, and then the Rachmaninoff, Bruch Violin Concerto. Rachmaninoff Symphonic dances. I will be doing the Bruch first, and then saving the last two pieces, Gershwin and Rachmaninoff, for the both Made in America theme, because those are both composers who wrote these pieces in America. And our theme this season is Made in America, written in America, pieces that Rachmaninoff and Gershwin, both Russian immigrants, Gershwin was born in America, but both Russians and writing in America. Totally different sides of the same spectrum, but so there's similarities in some ways, and I'll talk about that later. First is Bruch Violin Concerto. This is just like the golden oldie of this program, a very famous piece. It's a standard in the repertoire. And so Bruch, the music for this, up until he wrote some music for it in 1857. And then really completed it in 1866 had a premiere, and then Joseph Joachim edits it in 1868. But up until that point, before 1857, 1866, I mentioned in the notes, he was really known as a choral composer and a composer of operas. He still has a cantata that's still performed today, and a few successful operas. So this was his first attempt, a major attempt at orchestral composition, and that gift for writing for voice and for the lyrical voices and for choir really carried over well into this violin concerto, because it is what he is remembered for. That and the Scottish Fantasy, those are the two, both solo violin with orchestra. When you think of the famous violin concerti, the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, in more of the German tradition, we look at Brahms, Beethoven, Mendelssohn. Every one of those composers are also famous composers. Beethoven, obviously, Brahms, they all had so much repertoire outside of it. And Bruch is almost solely known for this work, the Violin Concerto. It's a shame, because he does have a lot of wonderful music. I don't think it's the fault of the music. I really think it's at the wrong place at the wrong time, but he was just born right in the shadow of Brahms. He's 5 years younger than Brahms, so he's in that style of Brahms as well. Not that it's imitative. Ironically, actually, the Bruch Violin Concerto came first, but they were both in what's called romantic classicists, and I'll talk meaning that. So the Romantic era started in the beginning of the 19th century, more or less, really Beethoven carrying it over with his Ninth Symphony. But there were romantics who honored classical forms and classical ideals, sound structures, no pun intended, firm ABA forms, ideas of phrases. Although these were edited and these were kind of manipulated, it's still not the new German school style of program music and going forward. These are still old forms. Brahms is very much in that school, Schumann's in that school, and Bruch as well. So Bruch luckily had the privilege of working with Joseph Joachim, who edited this. Joseph Joachim was the violinist, really, of the 19th century. He was the one you kind of went to for your violin, if you wanted a violin concerto performed or played. He was for all the best of the best, and he knew all the famous concerti intimately. He performed the Beethoven with Mendelssohn conducting when he was like 13 years old from memory. And he had a great quote. Although he knew, and he was good friends with Brahms too. He knew Brahms his whole life. He was good friends with him. But Brahms, the only one that he worked so closely on was Bruch's. And he says a great thing in the last last year of his life, and he was 75 years old, Joseph Joachim, in 1906. The year before he died at a party celebrating his birthday, he says, "The Germans have 4 violin concerti. The greatest, most uncompromising is Beethoven's, of course. The one by Brahms vies with it in seriousness, and yes, absolutely, even the last movement, that joyous last movement is very stately. The richest and most seductive was written by Max Bruch, but the most inward, the heart's jewel, is Mendelssohn's." So yeah, the richest and most seductive, what he said about Bruch's. This piece is just fantastic. I think Bruch is an amazing example of, you can follow formal procedures, absolute music procedures of sticking to a classical form and layout, but still write very expressive, very aesthetically appealing music. He, as much as Brahms, both of them I feel are in that school. And it speaks for itself. It's a wonderful piece. All the movements are written in a sonata form, which is the go-to form. And it's incredibly beautiful. There's not, since it's so absolute, it's music that speaks better for itself than words do. The soloist tonight, Philip Pagatti. Usually I don't work with a soloist much or mention them. I'm more on the end of just the musical, and Liz does promoting the soloist and talking about the soloist. But he's really great. I got to reach out to him. I think he's my age, or a little older, not much older than me. Just came out with a CD, a Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto CD, and he's this Slovak American Cultural Society has funded his appearance here. He's very receptive when I reach out to him on Facebook, so hopefully you guys get to all meet him. He's very talented. Next, I will go to the Gershwin, Porgy and Bess. So for tonight, we're doing Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin. It's an arrangement by Iain Farrington. Iain Farrington's the living composer and arranger about my age. And there's Gershwin himself, like most composers after they write an opera, did do an arrangement of this suite, arrangement of his opera into an orchestral suite, like Bizet for Carmen. That's very common. But the version he did, because it had, he's the musical composer, so many musicals, so when he made this arrangement for opera, he didn't want people to, think he was just doing like a Broadway revue. So the suite is a lot of the orchestral music, the background music, the quasi-glue music between scenes. It doesn't emphasize as much of the songs. And so a lot of the offshoot arrangements after that did the opposite, made, Ain't Necessarily So and Summertime, probably being the most famous Summertime. So Iain Farrington does a nice job with this, trying to get a nice combination of both, perfect happy medium. It's 25 minutes and tries to maintain the narrative of the opera, using those songs, but also having music connect, all music that Gershwin wrote. I'm going to talk a little bit about, use this opportunity to talk about the theme in Made in America, because it'll go into Rachmaninoff well, and it's so important with this piece, and I think with Gershwin in general, although we're not doing the whole opera, you're going to hear it, and you're just going to think of this sound of Gershwin as jazz, as we know him as the jazz composer. And I put in the notes, I like what I said. What I meant is that how I put, it's important to recognize and keep in mind about, although we remember Gershwin as the archetypal jazz man, it is important to keep in mind the classical outline or shell that he intends for so much of his music. The piano concerto and F, you just titled piano concerto, preludes for piano, the rhapsodies, miscellaneous duets and dance pieces, and perhaps being the grandest example, the Porgy and Bess opera, and he labels it, he says opera unashamedly. And how he has written so many musicals, he would have there's not trying to kind of hide behind what this form is. He would have just labeled it a musical. He was very explicit about an opera. And there's things you can read. There's a quote that I found a lot, and it's on Wikipedia, that he says, he quotes a New York Times article, and it's good, but I really wanted to go back and find more, and I'm going to do that. I use it said it was a New York Times article from 1935, and I am a subscriber to the digital New York Times, which I recommend. It's great. They have a great online. You can read from anywhere all their articles, and all of them you can go back, and there's a certain point when it, becomes, it's called the time machine, and you just read facsimiles of these old newspapers. And I found it from October of 1935, almost 83 years ago to the day. It was October 20th, 1935. Rhapsody in Catfish Row. Catfish Row is the fictional place in South Carolina that Porgy and Bess takes place. Mr. Gershwin tells the origin and scheme for his music in the new folk opera called, Mr. Gershwin tells the origin and scheme for his music in that new folk opera called Porgy and Bess. This is grand news. The first paragraph, what he explains about, writing I wanted to read what he wrote in this second paragraph. I think it's so important. He says, because Porgy and Bess deals with Negro life in America, it brings to the operatic form elements that have never before appeared in opera, and I have adapted my method to utilize the drama, the humor, the superstition, the religious fervor, the dancing, and the irrepressible high spirits of the entire race. If, in doing this, I have created a new form, which combines opera and theater, this new form has quite naturally come out of the material. The reason why I did not submit this work to the usual sponsors of opera in America was that I hoped to have developed something in American music that would appeal to the many rather than the cultured few. That's a very bold statement for 1935, and that seems to be a problem that many orchestras and many art organizations are battling with today, appearing to the large few, not appearing to the large masses, not just the cultured few. And he says that very unashamedly and by saying his statement, it seems a little, oh, I'm gonna invent a new form of mixing opera and theater. But it's spot on. I think, it's, with American music, many of you know I spend my life in classical music and I dealt with that, but really within the last year I've kind of analyzed where classical music fits in American, specifically how Americans view classical music or what it is, and how it's, for the most part, a European form. It really is, and what started when Gershwin came to codify an American sound, it became jazz. I mean, even what Copeland does with the sounds of the open plains or the South, that all comes from this folk sound. But of the high art form of jazz, I was thinking, I had a dinner recently with a friend for her birthday, and we were at the, it was a friend who's not a musician, but well-read, who's kind of cultured and kind of, who has good, is street smart and comments on things well, and we were at the Hard Rock Cafe, and there's rockers everywhere, and there's Tom Petty and Kurt Cobain posters and guitars, and the whole menu is designed, and now they have all kinds of posters, people who aren't rock artists, like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it's just a popular spot. The menu's designed, it's this huge, big sign, the Hard Rock Cafe, it's this, national thing, and I just said, well, if I tried to start a hard classical cafe, I think that would do well. It's all classical composers, it's all cafe. And it's good, being supportive. We're not trying to be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, or just be honest and say, no, that won't work. But she just said, as I'll never forget, yeah, maybe in Europe, not in America, but in Europe that would work. And that's exactly right. She's precisely right. And I particularly have more to say this because I just recently started writing for a UK-based chamber group. It's the first time I've written or worked with someone overseas, and I'm just learning of their whole culture and lifestyle. They too have problems with attendance, but the stuff that we would need to get a National Endowment for the Arts here or be a MacArthur Fellow, they have funding for so easily, and it's so classical music is a different form, and I think Gershwin knew that when he came to America. He doesn't look to subvert the classical genres and styles. He respects that America needed a new voice, but also understands that that doesn't mean disrespecting the forms, writing, and that's why he wrote these piano concertos. I mean, the orchestration for American in Paris is a mess sometimes. It just feels like, and one thing I love what this arrangement tonight, Iain Farrington does, he purposely uses a small pit band style, so I know this is an orchestral concert and it feels kind of odd, but I think that's a good choice. That's where Gershwin really felt home. All of his musicals are the original Rhapsody in Blue was written for that. The original Rhapsody was written for the brass band and piano. The famous orchestral arrangement we know today was by Ferdy Groffet. That's not by Gershwin. So anyway, that's all to say. Gershwin brought that form of jazz, and I feel like this cultural obligation for many American composers to say they're influenced by jazz. It's like kind of you're trendy if you say you're influenced by pop music and jazz. And I have 2 degrees in composition, so I just went through composing and just so jaded with seeing that. And just because you play jazzy chord or these things that are terms, it makes it feel more contrived than actually jazzy chords. There's not a lot of people who excel in it. Frank Zappa is one in really blending genres well. But George Gershwin is, for me, I know I don't want to. I'm the historian, so I don't like giving my opinion. I just share the history, and you can make your own synthesis. But for me, he is that ultimate, he is just phenomenal at doing that, at being unashamedly, his voice, unashamedly jazz, but still in classical forms. You'll hear that tonight, and like I said, if he wanted to write a musical, he would have. This is a call to folk opera. He wrote his own spirituals, Summertime, the very famous Summertime. That's that song is the opening of the. It's an aria. He doesn't call it a song; he calls it an aria, just like in opera. And the music that connects it is just like in an opera. He uses the techniques of an opera. He's not musical, like Saturday in the Park, which all the other musicals he wrote. This Brooklynite, small Jewish Brooklyn man, writing about the struggle of the African American, the Deep South, South Carolina, not Deep South, Coastal South, in the early 1930s. And he did a phenomenal job. And speaking of a Russian in America, he's first generation. He was born in Brooklyn, but Rachmaninoff was not. Rachmaninoff. This is great. I'm always, like I said, I'm always excited to do these lectures, but particularly for this piece. This is one of the hardest pieces, really, in the Rev to do. You really will not see this piece done in suburbia. You have to go to the big cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, to see this done. So it's a real treat, and I applaud David for doing, especially the last movement. This is the last piece Rachmaninoff ever wrote. He wrote it in 1939, 1940. He died in 43. And it's the only piece he wrote entirely in America. He was living on the North Shore of Long Island. He was at Orchard Point for a retreat with his family, basically as a retirement vacation. That's back when Long Island was a retreat, a nice place to visit. I'm just kidding. No, it's not the same. But it was a real nice area. And this is almost like a surprise piece. I think I put in my notes, this is a side of the Rachmaninoff we never knew. There's some theorists who believe that this was him experimenting a new style, or he's about to start a whole new phase, which is not, you can definitely not deniable. The sound is totally different. It's not the Rachmaninoff we know and love, but just like we put the Beethoven eras, early stage, middle stage, and late stage, this would be the late. But I feel like it's the beginning of his late and the end. There's a lot of things that Q knew that he wasn't probably going to write another piece. He had stopped writing most of the 1930s and almost completely stopped between 1937 and 39 before he wrote it. And for the most part, he's the last real Russian romantic in the Russian tradition. He summed up, after the success of the Second Piano Concerto, he really kind of avoided a lot of the trends that were going on pretty successfully, and kept to his voice, save for this last work, which he didn't need to write. Like I said, he was away and he had stopped writing. It would have been expected that he didn't, but he has a great relationship with the Philadelphia Orchestra and Eugene Ormandy. That's who he wrote it for, and that's who premiered it. And and the sounds and the colors of this piece are fantastic. It's finally like Rachmaninoff reaching back to those Russian roots of that sarcastic writing that we see here in Prokofiev and Shostakovich and even Stravinsky. The first movement, I want to talk about that I'll spend the most on because the first one's the most famous. It starts with these very hit, powerful, vertical chords. Like I said, edgy, but it's still smooth. This isn't the Second Piano Concerto. This isn't the variation on a theme by Pagan Rhapsody that we all know and love. Those pieces we know so well. It's still there. There's still Rachmaninoff in there. Those cascading fourths and fifths and the beautiful sonorous melodies, but especially some of this in the second movement, it's really great to hear him try a new form that he had not. I think the biggest thing, he's in America, and we're the whole made in America, Americanisms, that could have been what inspired him to try a new style, a new form, although this wasn't specifically American. The first movement, only the first movement, has a saxophone, a very famous saxophone solo. There's a funny story when he was in the car with Robert Russell Bennett, who we know today as the famous orchestrator. He orchestrated My Fair Lady, Oklahoma, Yorkshire, all those musicals. Yeah, so they were in a car. I think he was driving him to the train station. He was like the composer arranger at the time. So if he wanted something written, instruments will read in different keys, and especially if it's musicals or with saxophone, every instrument's in a different key, not like strings, which are all. So he was nervous about writing for saxophone, but Rachmaninoff really wanted to do it. So he contacted, when he was in America, Robert Russell Bennett, and he drove him to the train station to bring him back. And there's this story where he stops the car, looks at him, and says, "So I start on A sharp," and Robert he goes, "Yep, okay, right," and then drives on because the saxophone is an E flat instrument, so the melody's in C sharp minor, do, 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 and you have to start on A sharp, a minor third, really. A major minor third, but major sixth. So but he was very daring to do it. You had seen it in Bizet. Bizet does it in La Lexion Suite. and then Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's picture access, and he uses the saxophone. But Rachmaninoff had no reason to really use it. He wasn't, I mean, he's in America, so using a saxophone to us, to our modern ear, screams Americanism, because to us that's our jazz instrument. That's what's always that was not a standard instrument in the orchestra. Even when the clarinet was added to Mozart's time, and then the oboe, and then all the bass tubas, and all that, from the edge of the great romantic German orchestras, saxophones were not added in there. That became it was a color instrument. And I think that's more believable. It's less romantic, it's more objective. But I think Rachmaninoff, one of the greatest pianists, really one of the greatest to walk the earth. And what is so important about the piano is all the different colors you can get. You say colors and tone. You can get 20 recordings of Bach or the Beethoven piano sonatas, and they'll all sound different because piano's not like an organ. Even more than strings, there's so much levels of, and so he was very sensitive to that color. So I think even though it's in the first movement for one little lick, he wanted that saxophone. It comes very organically out of the oboe, out of the clarinet. Second movement was like a deranged waltz, if you can even call it a waltz. Yeah, it's this piece that, because waltz is more the well-adjusted German term for the dance. It's in 1, 2, 3, but it's got this wind writing. It's very murky, and that's the one that really sounds like you're listening to a Shostakovich early symphony or piano concerto. It's this fantastic piece. It's small and it's got stopped horns and everything. Then the third movement brings back the opening style of the opening movement, the ABA. The third movement is very interesting. Rachmaninoff, on the grand scheme of sacred composers, is by no means a sacred composer. We think of Bach or Mendelssohn who wrote cantatas, and Rachmaninoff wrote a piece which we know as Vespers, but I think it translates better to All Night Vigil. That's actually the proper. He wrote in 1950, one of his earliest works. It's an a cappella Russian choral piece that sets in the Russian Orthodox style, the Mass. It's a sacred choral work, but we know Rachmaninoff is the very, like Brahms, the objective, the absolute composer writing in forms, the variations on a theme, preludes, the concerto, the symphony, the third symphony, so famous. So, this is not a sacred piece, I'm not saying, but he does a quote that had not really been seen something like this since the Vespers, the All Night Vigil in 1915. It's the one that sounds most like the dance of the devil, like a danse macabre. You hear this sound, this keeps the dances, that actually, this one what points to why he originally thought of this piece as the fantastic dance. He wanted to call it fantastic. Fantastic used the same way as like Symphonie Fantastique. Berlioz, who ends up using the same thing, that's the Dies Irae, and I'll mention that in a bit. He had thought of labeling each movement like a metaphor of life: noon, twilight, and moonlight, the three movements. There are only three, these are the three dances, just 1, 2, and 3, but he had titles like morning, noon, and evening, representing the phases of life. And this makes me think it's like a Bartók third piano concerto, which is I think it's very similar. Bartók's in America at the time, writing his third piano concerto in 1945, and he does a quote at the end. And he was very sick. After he finished that, he died like 2 weeks after writing that piece. I look at this piece very similar. Rachmaninoff was in America. He wasn't sick yet, but he's doing these Judgment Day things, the biggest being he includes the Dies Irae theme in the movement, and that the Dies Irae is the Gregorian chant, the Gregorian Catholic Mass chant that's so famously used. There's a famous Verdi movement, the Dies Irae, the Requiem, the Mozart Requiem, but the original melody, and I'll play it, he quotes, and it's most famously here for something. This is how it is performed in the actual modules and notes if you were to sing it in an old-fashioned Catholic church, original style with the hours of the service. Most famously used last movement, Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. Opening of The Shining, that electric keyboard in the 80s. That's also used. It's little Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, when all the movements of the Sanctus, the Benedictus are all kind of loving and welcoming. This is the movement that we're going to be judged for our sins. It's always the feared movement. So he uses this theme, and then he uses a theme that quotes his earlier work, the Vigil, the All Night Vigil, Vespers, in the 9th movement of it. And they're similar. They're in that modal kind of chant style. I'll play the opening of that. moment when the people come and see that that Jesus' body is gone, that he has risen, so they're discovering that. So it's known as the resurrection theme in combat with the Dies Irae theme in Rachmaninoff. Also noticing the similarities between those themes. This is something that I just wanted to mention off book. It's the neighbor tone is where, so like the scale, like the Beethoven Ode to Joy, da 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 da, that's a scale, it's going up 2 steps. A neighbor tone is like you're visiting your neighbor and then coming back, da da da. That's constant. That's the opening of the Dies Irae, bum 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 bum, and then it jumps lower. But they're separated between the skips are all neighbor tones. And this, the resurrection theme, is the inverse of that. So if you were to hold it into a mirror, it's like da 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 da, going up and down. So they are very similar, kind of overlapped. And that, I think, to me, is the conflict, but also like the Harry Potter, Voldemort, the similarities. They're the literary foils, but they're and he used them. He really doesn't quote it directly, Rachmaninoff. He's really avoiding it. You really can't even recognize it until about the middle of the movement. And then it starts to flourish, it's there, and then he presents this counter theme. And at that moment in the score, if you want to look at it later, I have it marked on my score, he wrote Alleluia the way a Russian would read it in the Latin translation. So it's like this Germanic Latin and French. A-L-L, A-L-L-I-L-I-L-U-Y-A, Alleluia. And he writes it right when that vigil section comes in, the choir singing, and they actually sing Alleluia in his Vespers, so he was very much aware of that. It ends with the kind of dark and light winning out, the very classic, very dramatic, very romantic way of looking at things, not so much, because also Italian and French, but it's in a different way, because it's a raised third and it ends on all these fifths. So he still keeps it, it's his magnum opus, I feel like, but in a very Rachmaninoff, in his own humble way. This is not this huge statement in relatively. I am going to play, I have left enough time, and we have a good amount of time, which is great, because I wanted to do some listening. Particularly wanted to do listening, because long story short, we knew this has been out for somebody, we've been doing this piece, this program has been sent for some time, and so a friend, a former board member of the new NJFO, who is now as a colleague and a good friend, he's really very nice guy, we were connected. He reached out to Liz Ryan, who's the director of the marketing and administration at the orchestra, to let her know that a new recording was recently released in September of Rachmaninoff actually playing the symphonic dances at a private event in New York in December. So we have a few Rachmaninoff recordings, but it's always the piano concerto, the famous works, and he did perform this piece. He wrote a 2-piano arrangement simultaneously with the orchestral score, and he performed it in Beverly Hills in 1942 with Vladimir Horowitz, and that event was not recorded, and then he died a year later. Yeah, it's a shame, but never before heard publicly was this recording at a private event in New York in 1940 of Rachmaninoff playing this at the piano. He's reading the full score, and he's playing, just him playing, you hear him humming too. And so this man who didn't want the attention, he wanted to remain nameless, that his name is Alan Steckler, but I'll just say his name once, and he emailed the orchestra saying, there's this recording that came out, this might interest you, and so Liz CC'd me, I was like, this is awesome, and he said we could do it in the lecture or put it on the post, and I reached out to him immediately and said, hey, I just bought it, Marston Records, a small, I don't know exactly the deals behind it, but a small record company in Pennsylvania, Marston Records, got a hold of it and released it, so I purchased it immediately, and he's been awesome, he's been a great resource and much help. Not like he knows much, he's a Grammy-winning classical music producer, but I won't say anything, so. I'm gonna play first the recording. This is it. I'm gonna play first Rachmaninoff sitting at the piano playing it as much as I can, and then I do want to get to the his orchestrations up until the point when the saxophone comes in, so you can hear him playing it, actually Rachmaninoff. And then I want to play something else. Alan Steckler recommendation. Says in Dead Poets Society why he dropped the clarinet, switched to saxophone, is just more sonorous. He has that same sense of rock, and it comes so organically out of the flute, oboe, clarinet, and then reed instrument, saxophone. And it's beautiful, that theme is so well. I want to play something else too that's so important. There's, at the end of this, like I was saying, this theme, this movement and the last movement are in a pretty standard theme, form, A, B, A. You have that da-da-dum, da-da-dum, stormy theme, and then the B theme is da-da-da, very lyrical, and it goes on to another tune, and then A comes back. It's rounded binary, very classic. But he does something interesting in the coda. He has this whole new theme that is very Rachmaninoff, but very uncharacteristic of this piece. And I'm going to go to that really fast. And it's stunning, you know, he doesn't usually, this is not a typical Rachmaninoff thing to mess with form like this. This is like a developmental theme, is very Beethovenian thing. I want you to play it. It's just for a shining moment before it alludes back to the ending. He said, with this melody, Rachmaninoff is reaching back to the most painful time in his life, and that's the crushing failure of his first symphony. For those of you may know this, his first symphony was deeply panned and had a horrible disaster premiere, and he was so depressed he gave up composing for 3 years, and he was just traumatized by it. And he had a psychologist who worked with him at the time. It was such, the talking cure at that time, who did so many methods, as much as going into like hypnosis and to try and snap him out of this funk. And the very next piece he writes is the Piano Concerto No. 2, which becomes one of the most famous pieces ever written. It is constantly, at least in the top 5 of the classical countdowns for WQXR and all around the world. So he dedicated that concerto to the therapist. But that's the theme. That's a theme in the first symphony. And this failure, that failure premiere is not like Brahms' first piano concerto, which was just panned, but it's still available. It was played. That performance was the last. Rachmaninoff just, destroyed. He never promoted the piece again. It was never played. It was never published until after he died. Parts, an orchestral score, two piano score, and parts were found, and it was orchestrated and it had its re-premiere. So I think Rachmaninoff was really trying to do, but he was hoping that wasn't found out. I mean, that was a way of almost his redemptive way of giving a theme that he loved from his first symphony the light it deserves at the end of the first movement. Like I said, I don't think he wanted us to discover that was in the first symphony, because there's plenty of formidable recordings of the first symphony now. It is a great piece. Hey, we have a little. I'm gonna play. We have some time. I'm gonna play Rachmaninoff playing that theme. The original, the recording from the 40s, 1940, has the whole uncut track, but then a cut track that's done, and that's just like the piece, and not all of it is played. But this track 3 starts right on this theme, and you can hear him rolling the chords. It's great. We got time, like I said, this is such a nice layout because you go right out there and there's the concerts, right? So we don't, like I said, my deadline's not, but we're good. Don't worry. I won't keep you guys. hey, real quick, before we finish off here, just want to mention, just when you didn't think it could get better, it's like Rachmaninoff on a great night, and Bruch and Gershwin, how could it get better? It does get better. FUMC has been awesome hosting us. They've been wanting to host us for a long time, so they've been so great. They've been promoting our concert and just putting, they wanted us to mention, I'm so happy to mention that starting today, there's a pumpkin patch. You probably saw it coming in over there. It just finished, so it 10:30 to 6:30 p.m., so it finished during my lecture, but fear not, between today and Halloween day, every day, from 10:30 to 6:30, you can go get pumpkins and all your fall needs. And all the proceeds, credit cards are accepted, and all the proceeds go to their youth group. So, hey, well, don't get an overpriced pumpkin. Why don't you go here and do God's work if money goes to good. And hey, it's great. And we're looking for, it's going to be an awesome concert tonight. I'm going to try, and you can't because it's the last track in C. That's why I really want to play the battle of the redemptive theme, resurrection theme, and the Dies Irae theme at the end of the Rachmaninoff dances. I'll play that on the way out while you guys are leaving. I'll see if you can hear the mic. Thanks, it's going to be an awesome concert. Thank you all so much for